It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Is that a knockoff? Elara Vance sneered, her voice cutting through the hushed murmurs of the memorial gallery like a serrated blade. She reached out, her manicured fingers, tipped with blood-red polish, pinching the sleeve of Elara's charcoal blazer. I suppose when one marries a common laborer, one must learn to embrace the aesthetic of the clearance rack. Elara Vance didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still beneath the towering oil portrait of her late grandmother, Beatrice. The air in the Vance estate always smelled the same, a cloying, suffocating mixture of expensive lilies and floor wax. It was a scent designed to mask the rot beneath the floorboards. Around them, the elite of the city paused, champagne flutes frozen halfway to their lips. The public humiliation was intentional, a calculated strike to re-establish the hierarchy now that the only woman who had ever truly loved Elara was in the ground. "It's wool, Mother," Elara said, her voice a calm, low vibration that stood in stark contrast to the older woman's shrill entitlement. "High quality, unbranded. It's meant to last, not to scream for attention." Elara let out a sharp, barking laugh that drew Sloane Vance toward them. Sloane, draped in a silk dress that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, smirked as she adjusted the heavy diamond pendant at her throat, a piece that had belonged to Beatrice only 48 hours ago. "Oh, Elara," Sloane sighed, her eyes raking over her sister with performative pity. "You don't have to be so defensive about being poor. We all know Julian's little contracting business is barely keeping a roof over your heads. It's actually quite brave of you to show up here looking so suburban." Sloane leaned in, the scent of her cloying $500 an ounce perfume invading Elara's space. "But really, darling, hide that wedding ring. That tiny little diamond is actually depressing the guests. It looks like something one might find in a box of cereal." Elara glanced down at the band on her finger. It was a simple, heavy platinum circle, the stone small but of a clarity that was mathematically perfect. Julian Thorne had given it to her 3 years ago, and to the world, he was just Julian, the man who fixed houses and wore work boots. The Vances had never bothered to look at his hands. They only saw the dirt under his fingernails, never the calluses of a man who built empires before breakfast. Julian stood a few feet away, leaning against a marble pillar. He looked every bit the out-of-place contractor in a suit that Elara had dubbed off-the-rack garbage. He caught Elara's eye and offered a microscopic wink. He was the billionaire developer the city whispered about, the ghost investor who owned half the skyline, but to the Vances, he was just the help Elara had settled for to spite them. "I'm here to honor grandmother, not to discuss my wardrobe," Elara said, her gaze shifting to Marcus Sterling, the family lawyer who stood near the buffet, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "You're here to sign the disclaimer papers, Elara," Elara corrected, her tone turning icy. She beckoned to Marcus, who approached with a leather-bound folder. "The estate is in a delicate position. Beatrice was senile at the end, and she made some clerical errors in her final wishes. Sloane and I have already handled the restructuring. You'll receive a small stipend, of course, provided you don't make a scene and embarrass us further with your presence." Arthur Vance, Elara's father, stood in the background, nursing a scotch and looking at the ceiling. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He never did when Elara was on the warpath. He was the silent witness to his own daughter's exile, a man who had traded his spine for a seat at the head of a table he didn't even own. "Clerical errors?" Elara asked, her forensic accountant's brain already ticking. She had spent the last decade auditing Fortune 500 companies, finding the cents that went missing in the billions. She knew the language of theft better than anyone in this room. "Exactly," Sloane said, reaching for a glass of vintage crystal from a passing waiter. "The house, the accounts, the offshore holdings, they all require a certain level of sophistication to manage. You've been away from this world too long, Elara. You've gone soft in the suburbs. Just sign the papers Marcus has, take your little check, and go back to your fixer-upper." Elara felt the weight of the folder as Marcus handed it to her. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, and expensive. As she flipped through the first few pages, her eyes didn't see the legalese, they saw the patterns. She saw the way the assets had been diverted into a shell company 3 months before Beatrice passed. She saw the forged initials on the transfer of the primary estate. Elara and Sloane thought they were burying a sister. They didn't realize they were handing a map of their own crimes to a woman who lived for the hunt. "You seem very sure of these numbers, Mother," Elara said, her thumb brushing against a specific line item. A $3 million maintenance fee paid to a company that didn't exist. "I am the matriarch of this family," Elara snapped, her face flushing beneath her foundation. "My word is the only number that matters. Now sign. We have a dinner reservation at La Valoris, and frankly, you aren't on the list." Elara looked around the room. She saw the vultures in designer silk, the father who wouldn't speak, and the sister who had already stolen the jewelry off a dead woman's neck. She felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over her. The sleeping lion didn't just wake up, it began to sharpen its claws. "I won't be signing this today," Elara said, closing the folder with a soft, final thud. Elina's eyes widened, her mouth twisting into a snarl. "Excuse me." "I need to have my own people look this over," Elara continued, her voice projecting just enough to ensure the nearby guests heard every word. "After all, we wouldn't want any more clerical errors to jeopardize the family legacy, would we?" "You ungrateful little," Sloane started, stepping forward, but Julian was suddenly there, his large frame moving with a grace that didn't belong to a simple laborer. He didn't say a word, he just stood beside Elara, a silent, looming threat that made Sloane stumble back half a step. "We're leaving," Elara said, her gaze fixed on her mother. "But I'll be back for the formal reading on Friday. I hope you've kept all the receipts, Elara, every single one." As they walked toward the heavy oak doors, Elara reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved with practiced speed. "Marcus," she whispered into the receiver as they hit the cold night air, not looking back at the lawyer who was watching them from the window. "I need the full audit logs for the Vance Trust from the last 5 years. And call my office. Tell them the sleeping lion is coming in early tomorrow." She glanced at Julian as he opened the door of their modest, 5-year-old SUV. "How long until the Thorne Group's acquisition of the Vance creditors is finalized?" Julian smirked, the predatory glint in his eyes matching her own. "The paperwork hits their desk at 9 a.m. Monday. By noon, you'll be their landlord, Elara." Elara looked back at the glowing windows of the mansion, where her family was currently celebrating her departure. They thought they had just kicked her out of the house. They didn't realize she was about to buy the ground they were standing on. The next morning, the sterile, white-walled office of Sterling and Associates felt like a sanctuary compared to the suffocating opulence of the Vance estate. Elara Vance sat across from Marcus Sterling, the rhythmic ticking of a vintage grandfather clock, the only sound in the room. The scent of old paper and expensive leather bound the space, a sensory anchor that grounded her as she stared at the digital files on her tablet. "It's all here, Elara," Marcus said, his voice heavy with professional disappointment. He slid a thick manila folder across the mahogany desk. The sound of the paper dragging against the wood was harsh in the silence. "Your sister hasn't just been overspending. Sloane has been funneling money from the Vance Trust into a shell company for 3 years. Your mother, Elara, signed off on every transfer, likely thinking she was just protecting the family's image." Elara flipped through the pages. Her eyes, sharp and analytical, caught the discrepancies immediately. "They didn't just kick me out because I asked questions. They kicked me out because the well is dry." The door to the private office swung open without a knock. Sloane Vance swept in, a whirlwind of silk and arrogance. She was draped in a limited-edition trench coat that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, her signature scent, a cloying, metallic floral, preceding her like a warning. "I thought I recognized that beat-up SUV in the parking lot," Sloane sneered, ignoring Marcus entirely as she leaned over Elara. "Still playing at being a professional, I see. It's a bit pathetic, Elara, even for you." Elara didn't look up from the folder. "I'm surprised you're here, Sloane. Shouldn't you be at the boutique? I hear the new season just dropped." I'm here to ensure Marcus has the paperwork ready for your formal disinheritance, Sloane snapped, her manicured nails clicking against the desk. Mother wants it finalized before the foundation gala on Friday. We can't have a struggling accountant linked to the Vance name when the Thorne Group representatives arrive to discuss the merger. Rage sparked in Elara's chest, but she kept her face a mask of cool indifference. This was the second time in 12 hours her sister had tried to erase her. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was an attempted social execution. The Thorne Group, Elara repeated softly, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. I hear they're very particular about who they do business with. They are, Sloane gloated, her voice dripping with entitlement. They value legacy, something you've clearly forgotten. Once we sign that merger, the Vance name will be back where it belongs, at the top, while you'll be lucky to find a job auditing a laundromat. Sloane turned to Marcus, her tone shifting to a sharp command. Make sure she signs the waiver for the family jewels, too. The Vance emeralds don't belong on someone who shops at department stores. Marcus cleared his throat, his gaze flickering toward Elara. I'll take it under advisement, Sloane. See that you do. With a final, dismissive glance at Elara's unbranded gray cashmere sweater, Sloane turned on her heel and marched out. The silence that followed was thick. Elara reached into her purse and pulled out a small, encrypted recording device. She tapped the screen, saving the file of Sloane's admission regarding the Thorne merger. She has no idea, does she? Marcus asked. None, Elara replied, her voice cold as a winter morning. She stood up, the quiet luxury of her clothes allowing her to move like a shadow. She thinks she's walking into a coronation on Friday night. She doesn't realize she's walking into an autopsy. She stepped out into the hallway, where Julian Thorne was waiting, leaning against the wall with the casual grace of a man who owned the air he breathed. He wasn't wearing his contractor's vest today. He wore a tailored suit that whispered of power rather than shouting it. The creditors are signed over, Julian said, his voice low and intimate. He reached out, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. The warmth was a sharp contrast to the cold fury in her veins. By Friday night, the Vance estate, the mansion, and even the ground the gala is built on will belong to the Thorne Group, or more specifically to you. Elara looked toward the elevator, her reflection in the polished brass doors showing a woman who was no longer hiding. 3 days, Julian. I want them to have 3 more days of feeling untouchable. And then, Elara said, the elevator chimes sounding like a death knell. I'm going to show them exactly what happens when you try to bury the person who knows where all the bodies are hidden. 2 days later, the air in the couture bridal suite was thick with the scent of lilies and Sloane Vance's mounting hysteria. The gala was only 24 hours away, and the favored daughter of the Vance family was vibrating with a frantic, greedy energy that set everyone in the room on edge. She stood on a velvet-covered pedestal, her reflection draped in $40,000 of hand-stitched silk that she hadn't paid for and never intended to. It's pulling at the hip, Sloane snapped, her voice cutting through the soft classical music playing in the boutique. She looked down at Elara Vance, who was sitting quietly on a low ottoman, a garment bag resting across her lap. Elara, get down here and fix the hem. The seamstress is clearly incompetent. Elara didn't move immediately. She adjusted the cuff of her cream-colored sweater, a piece of unbranded vicuña wool that cost more than Sloane's monthly car payment, though her sister clearly mistook its lack of logos for a bargain bin find. I'm an accountant, Sloane, not a tailor, she said, her voice leveled and cool. Elara Vance looked up from her champagne, her eyes narrowing behind designer frames. Don't be difficult, Elara. Your sister is under a tremendous amount of stress. The least you can do is make yourself useful for once. It's not as if your little bookkeeping job requires you to be anywhere important today. The insult was sharp, designed to remind Elara of her perceived place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. Elara reached out, adjusting Sloane's train with a reverent touch, as if she were handling a holy relic. Mother's right, Sloane sneered, looking at her sister through the mirror. You've spent your whole life hiding behind spreadsheets while I've been the face of this family. The least you can do is kneel down and fix the thread. Or are you too busy auditing your empty bank account? A ripple of laughter came from the two bridesmaids hovering in the corner. Elara felt the familiar heat of indignation rise in her chest, but she suppressed it, channeling the fire into the cold, hard logic of her plan. She stood up slowly and walked toward the pedestal. As she knelt to tug at the loose thread, her fingers brushed against the heavy folder tucked into her own bag. She wasn't just fixing a hem. She was measuring the height of the fall. An hour later, Elara escaped the suffocating perfume of the boutique and stepped into the sharp, sterile quiet of an office downtown. The scent here was different: old paper, expensive ink, and the weight of legal finality. Marcus Sterling was waiting for her, his desk cleared of everything except a single, thick blue folder. "The silent audit is complete," Marcus said, his voice grave. He pushed the folder toward her. "It's worse than we thought, Elara. Your sister hasn't just been dipping into the discretionary funds. She's been systematically draining the Vance Trust for 3 years. She forged your father's signature on the mortgage equity lines for the mansion. If the creditors called those loans today, the family would be on the street by nightfall." Elara opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the columns of numbers, the language she spoke better than anyone in her family. She saw the transfers to offshore accounts, the luxury retail payments disguised as consulting fees, and the sheer, breathtaking scale of the betrayal. "And the Thorne Group?" Elara asked. "Julian has already moved," Marcus confirmed, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. "He's purchased every cent of that debt. The liens, the mortgage, even the back taxes Elara ignored. He's bundled them all into a single holding company." Elara touched the signature line at the bottom of the final page. Her fingers traced the embossed seal. This was the weapon. It was a document that proved Sloane Vance was a thief and Elara Vance was a failure as a matriarch. "So," Elara whispered, the sound of the heavy paper crisp in the silent room, "who officially owns the Vance estate as of this moment?" Marcus leaned back, his expression one of professional admiration. "The holding company is registered in your name, Elara. Technically, your mother and sister are currently trespassing in your house. They just don't know it yet." "Let them have their gala," Elara said, her voice like a closing vault. "I want them to be at their absolute peak. I want Sloane in that dress, under those lights, surrounded by every person whose opinion she craves." She left the office and drove back toward the family mansion. As she pulled into the long, winding driveway, she saw the catering trucks arriving and the massive marquee being erected on the lawn. Arthur Vance was standing near the fountain, looking lost as decorators barked orders around him. He looked like a man who had realized he was a ghost in his own home. Elara stepped out of her car, the folder tucked securely under her arm. She saw Elara on the terrace, pointing toward the gardens and demanding more white roses. Her mother looked down and saw Elara, her lip curling in a familiar expression of disappointment. "You're late back," Elara called out, her voice carrying over the manicured hedges. "Sloane needs her jewelry polished and the seating charts are a mess. Try to keep up, Elara. Tomorrow is the most important night of your sister's life. We can't have you dragging us down with your lack of effort." Elara looked up at the sprawling limestone facade of the mansion, the house she now legally owned. She felt the weight of the silver key in her pocket, a secret power that made the air feel electric. "Don't worry, Mother," Elara said, a small, chilling smile playing on her lips. "Tomorrow night will be exactly what Sloane deserves. I've made sure of it." She walked past her mother, the sound of her heels on the marble foyer echoing like a countdown. She didn't head for the kitchen or the servants' entrance. She walked straight toward the master study, the folder clutched to her chest. 24 hours. The clock was ticking, and for the first time in her life, Elara Vance was the one holding the pendulum. The morning before the gala, the Vance estate felt like a stage set constructed on quicksand. Elara Vance sat on the limestone terrace, the bitter scent of double-shot espresso, cutting through the heavy, cloying fragrance of the 1,000 white gardenias that had just been delivered. Below her, in the sprawling gardens, a crew of workers was erecting a glass-floored stage over the reflecting pool. "It's a bit much for an engagement party, don't you think?" Elara didn't turn around. She knew the heavy, rhythmic tread of her father. Arthur Vance came to stand beside her, his face etched with a weariness that no amount of old money could mask. He looked down at the construction with a frown. "Sloane wants a spectacle," he sighed, leaning against the balustrade. "And your mother is determined to give it to her. She says the Thorne family expects a certain level of grandeur." Elara took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes tracking a worker who was carefully polishing the glass. "The Thorne family values stability, Father. Grandeur is often just a mask for debt." "Don't let Elara hear you say that," he whispered, though there was a flicker of realization in his eyes. He looked at Elara, really looked at her, noticing the way she sat, spine straight, gaze unwavering. "You've been very quiet lately, Elara. Are you doing all right? I know the transition back here hasn't been easy." "I've never been better," she replied, her voice as smooth as the marble table. The moment was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic clack-clack-clack of designer heels. Elara Vance swept onto the terrace, her silk robe billowing behind her like a battle flag. She didn't look at her husband. Her eyes were fixed on Elara's outfit, a simple, charcoal gray knit dress with no visible logos. "Still wearing that rags-to-riches aesthetic, I see," Elara sneered, reaching for a silver bell on the table to summon a maid. "It's embarrassing, Elara. People will think we've fallen on hard times if you keep dressing like a librarian's assistant. At least try to look like you belong in a house of this caliber." "I assure you, Mother, I feel very much at home here," Elara said. She reached into her leather portfolio and pulled out a single, heavy vellum envelope. "In fact, I was just reviewing the property's historical preservation clauses. You should be careful with that stage. If the weight distribution is off, the limestone beneath the pool could crack. It would be a very expensive mistake." Elara let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Expensive? Please. We have insurance for a reason, and I have architects for the technicalities. You just worry about the seating chart. I saw you move the Sterling family to the back corner. Move them back to the VIP tier immediately. Marcus Sterling is the only person keeping your father's headaches at bay." "Actually," Elara said, her thumb tracing the embossed seal on the envelope, "Marcus and I had a very long talk this morning. He's quite interested in the new structural changes I'm proposing for the estate." "Structural changes?" Sloane Vance appeared in the French doors, looking radiant and utterly vapid in a sundress that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. She was draped in a new diamond tennis necklace that caught the morning sun, sending blinding shards of light across the terrace. "The only change this place needs is more light. Julian Thorne said he likes open spaces. Once we're married, I'm thinking of knocking out the north wing to build a proper ballroom." Elara's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Knocking down walls is a dangerous business, Sloane. Sometimes the whole roof comes down with them." Sloane rolled her eyes, adjusting her necklace. "You're so dramatic. You're just jealous because Julian is bringing a master contractor by this afternoon to finalize the plans. A man named Thorne doesn't settle for historical preservation. He settles for the best." Elara glanced at her watch. Julian Thorne would be here in 3 hours, but not as a contractor. He was coming as the man who had helped her secure the final signatures to lock the Vance family out of their own bank accounts. "Enjoy the sun while it lasts," Elara said, rising from her chair. She tucked the envelope under her arm, the secret weight of the deed pressing against her ribs. "The forecast for tomorrow night looks quite transformative." "It's going to be perfect," Elara snapped, already turning her back to bark orders at a passing gardener. "Now go find something with a label on it. I won't have you ruining the photos." Elara walked away, her heels silent on the stone. She didn't head for her room. She headed for the master study, where the safe sat behind a portrait of a grandfather who had actually earned the family's fortune. She had 24 hours left to play the part of the ignored daughter. As she passed Arthur in the hallway, he caught her arm, his grip trembling slightly. "Elara, what did Marcus say to you? Truly." She leaned in, the scent of her expensive, unbranded perfume, a custom blend that cost 4 figures an ounce, filling the space between them. "He said the foundation is already gone, Father. Everyone is just waiting for the first person to trip." She pulled away and vanished into the shadows of the north wing, leaving her father staring at the sunlight on the floor as if it were a fading dream. The countdown had reached its final cycle. By this time tomorrow, the music would stop, and there wouldn't be a single chair left for the people who thought they owned the floor. The evening of the reception arrived with a heavy, artificial stillness that always preceded a Vance family storm. By 6 o'clock, the ancestral estate was transformed into a cathedral of performative grief. Tall, white lilies choked the air with a cloying sweetness that masked the scent of expensive gin and old wood. Elara Vance stood at the edge of the grand foyer, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool edge of the silver clutch she held. Inside, tucked behind a lace handkerchief, was a slim black flash drive, the culmination of 6 months of digital scavenging and forensic auditing. She watched the guests filter in, a sea of black wool and designer silk. Her mother, Elara Vance, moved through the crowd like a queen dowager, her movements practiced and sharp. She wore a vintage veil that cast a shadow over her eyes, though Elara knew there were no tears behind it. Sloane Vance followed in her wake, draped in a gown that looked more suited for a gala than a funeral reception. The fabric caught the light with every arrogant tilt of her head, a shimmering reminder of the money she hadn't yet realized was gone. "There you are," Elara said, her voice cutting through the low hum of the string quartet. She didn't look at Elara's face. Instead, her eyes raked over the simple, charcoal gray sheath dress Elara had chosen. "I suppose that will have to do. Though I told you, Elara, this is a night for the family to project strength. You look like a governess." "It's respectful, Mother," Elara replied, her voice a calm, steady anchor against the woman's disdain. Sloane leaned in, the scent of her cloying, $500 an ounce perfume hitting Elara like a physical blow. "It's drab, but then I suppose it matches your life. Did you bring that contractor husband of yours, or was he too busy fixing a leak to attend a proper event?" "Julian is here," Elara said, glancing toward the door. Julian Thorne entered the room a moment later, his presence immediately drawing the wrong kind of attention from the Vance women. He wore a suit that fit him perfectly, but he carried himself with the quiet, unassuming posture of a man who worked with his hands. To Elara and Sloane, he was a footnote, a mistake Elara had made to spite them. They didn't see the way his eyes scanned the room with the precision of a predator, or the way the waitstaff instinctively straightened when he passed. "Mr. Thorne," Elara said, her tone dripping with a condescending sweetness. "How kind of you to take a break from your projects to join us. There's a tray of hors d'oeuvres near the service entrance if you're hungry." Julian offered a thin, polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine, Elara. I'm just here to support my wife." Sloane let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Support? That's a charming way to say ride her coattails. Honestly, Elara, the charity you show this man is exhausting to witness." She turned her back on them, dismissing Julian as if he were a piece of furniture. "Mother, we should head to the library. The board members are asking about the foundation's transition." Elara felt Julian's hand settle on the small of her back. The heat of his palm was the only warm thing in the house. "They have no idea," he whispered, his voice so low it was barely a vibration. "None," Elara agreed. She felt a surge of dopamine, a quiet thrill of anticipation that made her pulse quicken. "They think they're about to inherit an empire. They don't realize they're standing on a hollowed-out shell." They moved deeper into the house, toward the master study where the air grew colder. Arthur Vance stood by the fireplace, a glass of amber liquid trembling in his hand. He looked diminished, his eyes darting toward Elara with a mixture of guilt and terror. He knew the foundation was failing, but he didn't know his daughter held the detonator. "Elara," he croaked, stepping toward her. "We need to talk, before Marcus arrives." "There's nothing left to say, Father," she said, her voice devoid of the warmth she usually reserved for him. "You had 20 years to fix this. Now the clock has run out." The wait for it moment arrived when Elara clinked a crystal spoon against her glass, the sound sharp and demanding. The room fell silent. She stood at the base of the grand staircase, Sloane flanking her like a gilded sentinel. Friends, family, Elara began, her voice projecting a regal confidence. Tonight is about honoring the past, but it is also about securing the future. Tomorrow, the Vance Foundation will begin its new chapter under Sloane's leadership. We are liquidating the secondary holdings to ensure our legacy remains untouched by the current market fluctuations. Elara watched as the board members nodded, none of them realizing that those secondary holdings had already been siphoned off by Sloane's bad investments and Elara's vanity. The room felt like a pressure cooker, the tension rising with every lie Elara spun. "It's a bold move," a voice rang out from the back of the room. Marcus Sterling stepped through the double doors, his leather briefcase looking heavy and ominous in the dim light. The family lawyer didn't look at Elara or Sloane. His gaze was fixed solely on Elara. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost, or perhaps a judge who had just finished writing a death warrant. "Marcus, you're early," Elara said, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "We weren't expecting the formal reading until tomorrow morning." "The timeline has changed, Elara," Marcus said, his voice echoing off the marble floors. He walked to the center of the room, placing his briefcase on a mahogany side table. The sound of the latches clicking open was like a gunshot in the silence. "I received a series of filings this afternoon that supersede the existing will. It seems there are certain discrepancies that require immediate address." Sloane's face paled, the color draining from her cheeks until she looked as white as the lilies surrounding her. She looked at Elara, her eyes narrowing in a sudden, sharp realization. "What did you do?" she hissed, her voice cracking. Elara didn't answer. She simply reached into her clutch and felt the cold, hard plastic of the drive. The countdown had hit 0. "I think everyone should take a seat," Marcus said, pulling a thick stack of documents from his bag. "This is going to be a very long night." The silence in the study was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the projector Marcus Sterling had positioned on the mahogany sideboard. Elara Vance stood near the heavy velvet curtains, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She felt the cool, familiar weight of the USB drive she had handed over moments before. Across the room, her mother gripped the arms of a Louis XIV chair as if it were a throne under siege. "Marcus, this is an absurdity," Elara Vance snapped, her voice trembling with a cocktail of indignation and fading authority. "We are here for a private family matter, not a theatrical display. Whatever discrepancies you think you found are surely just accounting errors from the staff Elara was supposed to be managing." She didn't even look at her eldest daughter as she spoke, treating her like a piece of furniture that had suddenly started making noise. Beside her, Sloane Vance was leaning against the bookshelf, her designer heels clicking impatiently against the hardwood. She looked bored, though the slight tremor in her fingers as she adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet betrayed her. "It's not an error, Mother," Elara said. Her voice was low, devoid of the frantic energy that usually filled these rooms. It was the calm of a surgeon before the first incision. Marcus clicked a button. The white screen mounted on the far wall flickered to life, illuminating the room in a cold, clinical blue. Spreadsheet after spreadsheet began to scroll, hundreds of line items, highlighted in a damning, aggressive red. "These are the forensic audits of the Vance estate's primary holdings," Marcus explained, his tone as dry as bone. "Over the last 3 years, approximately $42 million has been siphoned through a series of shell companies. The destination for every single cent was an offshore account registered to a SV Luxury Holdings." Elara's face went rigid. "Sloane, darling, tell him what this is. Some sort of tax strategy your father set up." Arthur Vance, sitting in the shadows of the far corner, finally looked up. His eyes were hollow, reflecting the glowing red numbers on the screen. "I didn't set that up, Elara," he whispered. "I haven't had access to those accounts in years. You gave that power to Sloane." The room seemed to tilt. Sloane Vance didn't just pale. Her face seemed to physically disintegrate before their eyes. Her eyes, usually sharp with calculated malice and the arrogance of the favored child, stretched wide until the whites showed all the way around the irises. vibrating with a frantic, trapped energy. The high, polished color on her cheekbones vanished instantly, replaced by a sickly, grayish hue that made her look years older in a single heartbeat. Her mouth hung open, her lower lip trembling so violently she had to bite it to stop the visible shaking. But even then, a small, choked sound escaped her throat. Her posture, once stiff with the pride of her old money aesthetic, collapsed inward, her shoulders hunching as if she were trying to disappear into the expensive silk of her blazer. It was the look of a predator realizing the cage door had been locked from the outside. "Sloane," Eleanor's voice was a thin, fragile reed. I can explain," she stammered, her gaze darting toward the door. "It was an investment. I was going to put it back. The market didn't fail, Sloane," Elara interrupted, stepping into the light of the projector. "You did. You spent $20 million on a lifestyle you couldn't afford, and the rest you lost trying to prove you were as smart as the people you look down on." Julian Thorne moved from the doorway, his presence suddenly looming and powerful. He wasn't the simple contractor they had mocked for months. He stood with the quiet, terrifying confidence of a man who owned the room and everything in it. He placed a steadying hand on Elara's shoulder, a silent witness to the carnage. Marcus cleared his throat, pulling a final document from his stack. "There is one more matter. Because of the massive debt incurred by these illegal transfers, the Vance estate went into default 6 weeks ago. The primary creditors sold the notes to a private equity firm. We'll just negotiate with them," Elara said, her voice rising in a desperate attempt to reclaim her status. "The Vance name still carries weight. Who bought the debt?" Elara reached into her clutch and pulled out a single, embossed business card, sliding it across the mahogany table toward her mother. The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of expensive lilies and the sudden, sharp metallic tang of fear. "I did," Elara said, her voice as cold as the marble floors. "I'm the creditor, Mother. I own the house, the accounts, and the very chair you're sitting in. And since Sloane has effectively embezzled the remaining liquidity, I'm afraid the Vance name is the only thing you have left." Elara looked at the card, then at the daughter she had spent a lifetime dismissing as a glorified clerk. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Behind her, Arthur closed his eyes, a single tear tracking through the dust of his pride. "You have until the end of the month to vacate," Elara said, her tone professional and final. "Security will be here at 8 a.m. to begin the inventory." Without waiting for a response, without glancing back at the wreckage of the family that had tried to break her, she turned and walked toward the foyer. Julian followed her, his stride echoing her own. As the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them, the first sounds of Eleanor's hysterical screams finally broke the silence of the house. The cold air of the foyer felt like a physical slap after the suffocating heat of the drawing room. Elara didn't stop, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the checkered marble that echoed like a countdown. Beside her, Julian walked with the quiet, predatory grace of a man who had seen many empires fall and had personally dismantled a few. Behind them, the sounds of chaos began to spill out of the double doors. The shrill, panicked pitch of Eleanor's voice and the heavy, uneven thud of someone stumbling. "Elara, you stop right there." Sloane's voice was a jagged blade, cutting through the silence of the hallway. She came skidding around the corner, her silk dress fluttering. Her face was flushed a violent, blotchy red that clashed horribly with her designer pearls. "You think you can just walk in here with some forged papers and a contractor husband and play act at being the boss? This is my house. This is the Vance legacy." Elara paused, turning slowly. She didn't look angry, she looked bored. The folder in her hand, bound in thick, charcoal-colored leather, felt heavy with the weight of 5 years of forensic accounting. She could smell the faint, metallic scent of the brass keys in her pocket and the cloying, expensive perfume that Sloane used like a shield. "The legacy you spent into the ground, Sloane?" Elara asked, her voice low and perfectly modulated. She didn't raise it, which only made Sloane's frantic screeching sound more pathetic. "The legacy you bled dry to maintain the illusion of a life you couldn't afford." "I didn't do anything," Sloane shouted, her eyes darting toward the two security guards who had appeared at the end of the hall. "Marcus, tell her this is a mistake." Marcus Sterling stepped out from the shadows of the library. His briefcase clicked shut with a sound as final as a gavel. The family lawyer didn't look at Sloane with his usual indulgent smile. Instead, he looked at her with the clinical detachment of an undertaker. He adjusted his glasses, the light catching the lenses and obscuring his eyes. "There is no mistake, Sloane," he said, his voice echoing in the vast, hollow space of the foyer. "I have spent the last 6 hours reviewing the offshore accounts Elara flagged. The signatures are yours. The transfer authorizations are yours. The systematic siphoning of the Vance Trust into private shell companies is, well, it's quite thorough and quite illegal." Sloane's features didn't just change, they seemed to dissolve. The carefully applied porcelain foundation cracked around her mouth as it hung open, her lips trembling with a silent, jagged rhythm. Her eyes, usually sharp with a predator's calculation, went glassy and unfocused, darting toward the mahogany walls as if the very wood might testify against her. The flush of rage that had colored her neck moments ago drained away, leaving a sickly gray pallor that made her expensive diamond earrings look like glass. Her shoulders, always held with a manufactured stiffness, slumped forward, her spine curving as the weight of her own greed finally crushed the air from her lungs. She reached out for the banister, her fingers slipping against the polished wood as if she no longer knew how to hold onto anything. "Dad," Sloane wheezed, turning toward the doorway where Arthur stood. He looked smaller than he had an hour ago, his face lined with a sudden, devastating clarity. "Dad, she's lying. She's always been jealous of me. She's trying to take everything because you loved me more." Arthur Vance didn't move. He looked at the daughter he had championed, the one he had held up as the gold standard while relegating Elara to the shadows of the help. He looked at the documents Marcus held out, the cold, hard proof that his favorite child had been robbing him blind while he slept. "I didn't just love you, Sloane," Arthur said, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "I trusted you. I gave you the keys to the kingdom and you sold the bricks behind my back." He looked over at Elara, his eyes brimming with a shame so deep it seemed to pull at his very soul. "Elara, I didn't know." "You didn't want to know, Father," she replied, her tone devoid of malice but stripped of warmth. "It was easier to believe the lie than to look at the daughter who actually did the work." Julian stepped forward then, his hand resting lightly on the small of Elara's back. It was a gesture of protection, but also one of ownership. He looked at Sloane, who was now trembling so violently her heels rattled against the floor. "The inventory begins at dawn," Julian said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "Anything not on the approved personal property list stays. If a single piece of Vance silver is missing, the police will be waiting at your new apartment. Though, given the scale of the embezzlement Marcus found, I suspect the state will be providing your housing soon enough." Sloane let out a sound, a high, thin wail of pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at the house, at the paintings she had bragged about, at the marble she had walked on as if she were a queen. It was all gone. The illusion had shattered, and the shards were cutting her to pieces. Elara turned toward the heavy oak front doors. She felt the cool weight of the brass key in her hand, the one that now controlled everything her family had tried to keep from her. She didn't feel the rush of triumph she had expected. Instead, she felt a profound, quiet peace. "You didn't just lose a house today, Sloane," Elara said, pausing with her hand on the iron handle. "You lost the only person who was actually willing to pay for your lies. I'm done subsidizing your arrogance." She pushed the door open, the hinges groaning with the weight of the history they held. The night air was crisp, smelling of rain and damp earth. She stepped out into the darkness, Julian at her side, leaving the screams and the wreckage of the Vance name behind them. As the door clicked shut, the sound was final, a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. She didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. The legal avalanche that followed Elara Vance's departure from her family estate was as swift as it was merciless. In the weeks that followed that final confrontation, Marcus Sterling moved with surgical precision, executing the contingency clauses Elara had spent years perfecting. The local tabloids feasted on the story, detailing the spectacular collapse of a dynasty built on a foundation of embezzled pride and stolen inheritances. Elara Vance had attempted to stage a social comeback, but the doors of the elite clubs remained firmly bolted against a woman whose favored daughter's crimes were now public record. Arthur Vance had quietly retreated into a self-imposed exile in a small coastal cottage, while Sloane Vance found herself entangled in a web of civil suits that drained her remaining accounts. By the time the spring thaw arrived, the Vance name no longer commanded respect. It served only as a cautionary tale of greed. 6 months had passed since the night Elara Vance turned her back on the wreckage of her childhood home. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new firm's headquarters, the skyline of the city shimmering under a pale morning sun. She smoothed the front of her charcoal wool trousers, bespoke, unbranded, and exuding the kind of quiet luxury that no longer needed to hide. The scent of fresh sandalwood and expensive ink filled the room, a sharp, clean contrast to the cloying floral perfumes that had once suffocated her. A soft chime announced a visitor. Marcus Sterling entered, carrying a single manila folder. He looked older, the stress of the liquidation having etched new lines around his eyes, but he offered a respectful nod he had never given her when she was just the difficult daughter. "The final distributions are complete," he said, placing the folder on her mahogany desk. He watched her for a moment, his professional mask slipping just enough to show a hint of admiration. "Your sister's last appeal was denied this morning. She's officially been vacated from the penthouse she was trying to claim as a protected asset." Elara didn't feel the surge of adrenaline she'd felt on the night of the reveal. Instead, there was a heavy, quiet peace. "And my mother. Elara is living on the modest annuity your father set aside," Marcus replied. "It's enough for a comfortable life, though she's currently complaining to her few remaining friends that the view from her new apartment is insultingly urban." Elara turned back to the window. She could see the park where she used to walk when she needed to escape the house. "She'll survive. She always does." "You did more than survive, Elara Vance," Marcus noted, his voice softening. "You rebuilt an empire from the ashes they tried to bury you in. Julian Thorne told me the merger is finalized. You're the majority shareholder of the new group now." "It wasn't about the shares, Marcus. It was about the truth." Later that afternoon, she stepped out into the crisp air, heading toward a small coffee shop near the train station. She saw her before the woman saw her. Sloane Vance was standing outside a mid-tier retail boutique, wearing a uniform that looked itchy and cheap. Her once perfect blonde hair was pulled back in a messy knot, and she was arguing with a delivery driver over a misplaced crate of inventory. The rage that used to boil in Elara's chest at the sight of her sister was gone. In its place was a clinical sort of pity. Sloane looked up, her eyes widening as she recognized the woman stepping out of the black town car. For a moment, the old Sloane flickered to life. The jaw tightened, the lip curled. But then she looked at Elara's tailored coat and the polished confidence in her stride. The fire in the younger sister's eyes died instantly. Sloane looked down at her scuffed, sensible shoes and hurried back inside the shop, her shoulders hunched. Elara kept walking. She reached the bench where Julian Thorne was waiting. He stood, his hand finding the small of her back. He wasn't wearing a tool belt anymore. His suit was impeccable, his presence commanding. "You saw her," he said. It wasn't a question. "I did," she whispered. "Regrets." Elara Vance looked at her hands. They were steady, but she felt the phantom weight of the family she no longer had. She had won the war, secured the fortune, and cleared her name. But the seat at the Thanksgiving table would always be empty. The father she had once adored was a ghost of a man, and the sister she had grown up with was a stranger in a polyester vest. "No," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "But justice has a bitter aftertaste, doesn't it?" She watched a single yellow leaf spiral down to the pavement, crushed under the wheel of a passing bus. The Vance name was gone, replaced by something stronger, something hers. She was no longer the sleeping lion. She was the one who had survived the jungle, even if she'd had to leave the pride behind to do it.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.